My name is Blair Rubel. I'm Director of Comparative Urban Studies here at the Wilson Center. And basically, they allotted 15 minutes for what's going to take about 5 minutes. I'm just welcoming you to the Wilson Center, and I'll turn the floor over in a moment to Brian Wampler. Today's public seminar comes at the end of a day and a half of meetings of a workshop examining questions of participatory governance and decentralization in a comparative context. And we wanted to give an opportunity to share some of the discussion and some of the work of the people who have participated in the workshop with all of you. The workshop has been supported, if you got the handout, you'll see, it's been supported by the Wilson Center, and I want to thank my Wilson Center colleagues, and by Boise State. And it's been a really very effective collaboration. And I'm going to turn the moderating over to Brian Wampler from Boise State. But before I do, I want to thank my Wilson Center colleagues, Allison Garland and Lauren Hertzer, for all the work they did in making today's meeting possible. And I want to preempt part of what Brian is going to say by congratulating Stephanie McNulty on a brand new book, which I gather arrived even here while you were here.
Yeah, this is the first copy.
So there's one copy of this book in existence, which is always the best copy.
To give you all a discount.
So I wanted to thank Stephanie.
No, thank you.
We handed out the bios, so I'm not going to introduce everybody. I'm not even going to introduce Brian as he's mentioned in the bio, but I want to introduce him as someone who's been really a wonderful colleague to work with, a friend. The idea of these meetings grew out of conversations we had in Rio de Janeiro at the World Urban Forum. And Brian not only knows a lot about Brazil, for those of you who are Brazilianists, you probably know that already, but he is one of the foremost thinkers on issues of participatory governance. So it's been great to work with Brian, and with that, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Good. Well, thanks for the introduction, Blair. And I want to thank Blair as well as Allison and Lauren for helping to organize and bring together. For the last day and a half, there were, I think, roughly 16 academics or people who are a couple of people in the policy area who have been talking about these issues of participation, decentralization, what sort of impacts, how we should think about the role that these can play in transforming states and transforming societies. And the Boise State funds, it was quite fortuitous. It actually came out of Obama's stimulus package. And you may remember Obama gave money down to the states then gave it to the universities then distributed it along. And it just so happened a year ago I was talking to this about my dean, and she said, sure, we can help support that. That seems like a good use, and take the money back to Washington became the theme of. But I don't want. I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. First, we have Frank Fischer, and Frank, Stephanie, and Archon are each going to speak for about 15 minutes. Frank is a professor at Rutgers University, and he's done quite extensive work on the role of deliberation and the use of technical information, the role of science and environmental politics. So, Frank.
Thank you, Brian. My remarks are something of an overview on the issues that we've talked about, I guess from my take on them. Participatory governance is a subset of governance theory that puts emphasis on democratic engagement, in particular through deliberative practices. Governance and participatory governance have rapidly become important topics in the social sciences. During the past several decades, participatory governance has made its way into the political practices of a significant spectrum of organizations, generally advanced as a response to what's called a democratic deficit characteristic of contemporary political systems. Participatory governance has been embraced by major organizations such as the World Bank, the U.S. Agency for International Development, UN Habitat, the European Union. All have put money and effort into the development of participatory processes. Many of these issues have drawn their inspiration from progressive projects of political parties in Brazil, India, Spain, Mexico, UK, and others. To the list, we could also add civil society organizations such as Oxfam, Action Aid, the International Budget Project, actively disseminating information and promoting participatory practices. Both theory and empirical experience with governance demonstrates that there are numerous patterns of participation and non-participation, from non-democratic elitist top-down forms of interaction to radically democratic modes from the bottom up. Governance as such tends to refer to a new space for decision-making, but does not in and of itself indicate the kind of politics that will take place within them. It's a theory and practice of public engagement through deliberative processes, emphasizing deliberative empowerment of citizens, and aligns itself in varying degrees with work on deliberative democracy in political theory and deliberative experimentation in public and policy-related fields of contemporary social and political research, as well as political activism on the part of various public organizations and foundations. Whereas citizen participation in the governmental process has traditionally focused on measures designed to support and facilitate increased public access to information about governmental activities, efforts to extend the rights of citizens to be consulted on public issues which affect them and to see that the broader citizenry will be heard through fair and equitable representative political systems, participatory government seeks to deepen this participation by examining assumptions and practices of the traditional view that generally hinder the realization of a genuine participatory democracy. It reflects a growing recognition that citizen participation needs to be based on more elaborate and diverse principles, institutions, and methods. These begin with more equal distribution of power, a fair distribution of resources, the decentralization of decision-making processes, the development of a wide and transparent exchange of knowledge and information, the establishment of collaborative partnerships, an emphasis on institutional dialogue, and greater accountability. All of these measures seek to create relationships based as much or more on trust and reciprocity than advocacy, strategic behavior, and even deceit. It involves as well the provision of means to engage individuals and organizations outside government through political networks and institutional arrangements that facilitate supportive, collaborative-based, discursive relationships among public and private sectors. They have involved a number of important shifts in problem solving and service delivery, including more equitable forms of support for economic and social development. Along the way, it's often meant a transition from professionally dominated to more citizen or client-based activities, frequently taking place within new civil society organizations. Participatory governance also seeks to contribute to the development of democratic communicative skills, citizen empowerment, and community capacity building. Its practices are based in the view that participation contributes to human development, generally both intellectually and emotionally. Many NGOs engaged with these practices speak of people's self-development and empowerment as primary goals, emphasizing political rights, social recognition, and economic redistribution in the development of participatory approaches. Rather than merely speak for the poor or marginalized citizens' interests and issues, they assist people in developing their own abilities to negotiate with public policymakers. Projects in Porto Alegre or Kerala, India, show that citizens with less formal education can, under the right conditions, also participate with high levels of competence. Indeed, they have impressively participated in planning projects, the likes of which often are seldom seen in the advanced industrial world. In terms of capacity building, as the development of a community's ability to deal collectively with its problems, the approach can contribute to a sense of social togetherness. Rather than the relative passive role of the individual, participatory governance also helps to connect and enable competent individuals to build together the kinds of social capital needed for joint problem solving. It does this in part by building social trust and the kinds of mutual understanding that it can facilitate. This involves a devolution of power and resources from central managerial control to local democratic institutions and practices, including street-level administrators willing to assist community members in taking charge of their own affairs. For many, the underlying goal is to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of the provision and management of public services. A range of experiences show that community participation can improve the efficiency of programs in terms of uses of sources and effective projects that achieve their intended outcomes in the provision of the delivery of services, we find this both in the developed and developing world. In fields such as education, healthcare, environmental protection, forestry, and irrigation, it is seen to lead to quicker responses to emerging issues and problems, more effective development and design of solutions appropriate to local resources, higher levels of commitment and motivation in program implementation, and greater overall satisfaction with policies and programs, certainly in many cases. Furthermore, an emphasis on efficiency tends typically to lead to improved monitoring of processes and verification of results. Research has shown that decisions made through the participation of community members rather than traditional elites or unaccountable administrators offers less powerful groups in the community better chances of influencing the equitable distribution of resources. But this is not always the case. Empirical investigation tends to be mixed on these issues. Overall, investigation shows that community participation can lead to more equitable outcomes, but it is particularly difficult to achieve such results in inequitable social contexts. Equitable outcomes more commonly occur in combination with other factors such as those related to the distribution of power, motivation levels of the participants, the presence of groups that can facilitate the process, and so on. One of the difficulties in assessing the impact of such participation is that there is often no reliable information about the distribution of benefits and costs to households, thus making it difficult to render comparative assessments, a point that we discussed here in some detail. Some argue that by diffusing authority and control over management, decentralized participation can also weaken efficiency. But it seems to depend on the design, and this does not need to be the case. Another crucial issue concerns political representation and the distribution of power. On the theoretical front, many of the projects have been influenced by work on deliberative democracy in political theory. It's grounded in the idea that deliberative approaches to collective decisions under conditions of conflict produce better decisions than those resulting from alternative means of conducting politics, from coercion, traditional deference, to markets. Thus, decisions resulting from deliberation are likely to be more legitimate, more reasonable, more informed, more effective, and more politically viable. Because participatory governance is introduced to compensate for the failures of representative government the failure to adequately connect citizens to their elected representatives, the ability to bring together these two models, representative government and local decentralized governance, is important. Examples of how this can be done are found in places like Porto Alegre in Brazil and Kerala, India. Participatory government, as already noted, seeks to give voice to those without power, but it can unintendedly generate manipulation and co-optation, which often makes it difficult to judge the significance of participation in such projects. At present, participatory governance often exists as much or more as a strategy for struggling against political imbalances than as an altogether effective counterbalance to them. As is the case with service delivery and equity, there's nothing simple or straightforward about either political representation and equitable power arrangements in participatory projects. Indeed, there's no shortage of things that can block effective political participation. In some cases, these activities have given rise to a new breed of public servant, frequently schooled in NGOs, devoted to offering assistance to the marginalized or excluded, as government officials or independent consultants to parallel institutions. They've often played an essential role in the development and spread of such participatory approaches to governance. Some of these professionals, along with their respective theoreticians, have sought to reconceptualize the role of the public servant as a facilitator of public engagement, or what Feldman and a colleague have called creators of communities of participation. Final remarks. Participatory governance offers significant new insights into questions that have long been ignored in traditional political analysis and democratic theory, and I think we really managed to underscore those in the last day and a half. But many questions remain, which we also underscored, and the task of sorting out the positive and negative elements contributing to the success and failure of such projects thus takes on particular importance. Independent of a good deal of rhetoric associated with discussions about participation, the evidence about new forms of participatory governance illustrates participation to pose difficult issues with no simple solutions. A closer look reveals that while citizens can participate and that participatory governance can improve both democratic decision-making and effective service delivery, participation has to be carefully organized, facilitated, even one could say cultivated and nurtured. Given the difficulties involved in designing and managing participatory processes, it comes as no surprise to learn that citizen participation schemes rarely follow smooth pathways. Participatory government, despite its promise, is a complicated and uncertain business that needs to be carefully thought out in advance. It's the kind of thing we've tried to think about here for the last 2 days. This should be the first priority of those engaged in both the theory and methods of such practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Our next speaker is Archon from Kennedy School at Harvard University.
Thanks a lot. Let's just take a second for this thing to come on.
I think this one's mine.
Great. So I just wanted to spend my time in these remarks talking a little bit about a perspective on participation and how it fits with representative government that I call pragmatic democracy. And let me just flesh out a little bit of Frank's remarks with a couple of examples to fix your minds a little bit. So probably a lot of people in this room have lived in or around D.C. for some time. Not Adrian Fenty, but the mayor before him, Tony Williams. I have the pleasure of sitting in an office that's down the hall from him right now, so we talk a fair bit. But when he was mayor, he convened twice over the course of his term, citizen summits in which he invited thousands of people from all over D.C. to come and review his public budgets. And he made a commitment to listen to what they said, what their priorities were, and then he fed that back to the people who went to say, here's what I heard, here's how I changed the budget accordingly. And he really thought that was important. It's not really in him. He's a Kennedy School graduate, so he's kind of trained technocrat. But he realized that the fact of his being elected was not enough for people just to accept his say-so for even decisions like the budget. So he convened these citizens' summits. Adrian Fenty, I think it's fair to say, had quite a different approach to governing Washington, D.C., and may have paid a price for that. So that's kind of one example of the kind of thing that we talked about over the last day and a half. Another example comes from the 49th Ward of Chicago, where an alderman named Joe Moore, who's in charge of his neighborhood that he represents is Rogers Park, which is a very nice kind of mixed-income neighborhood on the north side of Chicago near the river, or near the lake. And every alderman in Chicago gets $1.3 million to spend to fix potholes, to polish up a graffiti, whatever it is, whatever they decide. For the last couple of years, he's taken a lesson from the south of Brazil, from this thing that people have talked about a lot over the course of the last day and a half called participatory budgeting. And what he's done is he said, okay, well, I'm going to take this $1.3 million and I'm not going to decide. I'm going to let people in Rogers Park decide. And so he's convened a bunch of groups of task forces of people proposing different ideas, and that's how he allocated the $1.3 million, right? So what ended up getting built were bike lanes, rehabilitation of some parks that people thought were important, some arts projects, and so on, right? And those are a couple of examples from the U.S., and we could go through more. The one I actually consider the U.S. kind of a slowpoke in this regard. There's not a lot of democratic innovation going on in the U.S. compared to places in Latin America or even Indonesia, or lots of other places in the world. And we can talk about why, but that's a couple of examples of things that are happening in the U.S. that are in the ballpark of participatory innovation, right? And you guys probably know a lot more. So what is the point of these innovations? What do they aim to do? Right? So Frank talked about improvements in service delivery, public accountability, maybe social justice. People want a lot of things out of these innovations. And I kind of think that a good way to think about why we're seeing so many innovations right now is that they're more a response to frustration with the status quo ways of governing ourselves than any particular aspirations of what we hope these innovations do. I think we see lots of frustration with what elections and public bureaucracies cannot do, and so we're inventing all sorts of things, new consultations, participatory budgeting, public deliberations, maybe transparency and open government, in the hope that these will help us reach some better state of governing. And so my favorite piece of anecdotal evidence for this comes from a speech that Gordon Brown gave in 2007 when he was head of the Labour Party of the UK, right? So he's head of the Labour Party and head of the government at that time, and he gives this speech about how representative government just isn't all it's cracked up to be, and certainly not what it was. And so he says in this speech to the National Council of Voluntary Organizations in 2007, I'm quoting now, "So I don't want to carry on with politics as usual. Let us not delude ourselves. Once nearly 84% of people voted. In the last general elections, it was less than 62%. In the 1950s, 1 out of every 11 people joined a political party. Today, it is 1 in every 88. Once political parties aggregated the views of millions. Now they need to broaden their appeal to articulate the views of more than just a few. In 1987, nearly half the electorate identified very or fairly strongly with a political party. Now only 1 in 3 years do so. 20 years ago, 4 in 10 people trusted the government to put the needs of the nation above those of political party. More recently, it was only 1 in 5. And so in the United States, political parties are not doing much better, probably a good deal worse than that in terms of the amount of public trust they enjoy. And so what we see in response to this frustration is a big range of democratic innovations, many of them in the participatory, with a participatory character, right? And so the important question to ask yourself is, will this amount to anything? In 5, 10 years' time, will we see grafted onto or even replacing big parts of the ways that we govern ourselves in the United States and across the world a whole set of participatory institutions that complements right now the structure of elections, right? And so I think nobody knows the answer to that question. I think the answer to that question may be yes. But the point is, we may be in a moment of the reinvention of our political institutions in a more participatory direction, okay? Now, why, if you're Adrian Fenty or Barack Obama or Lula or anyone, an elected official, should you accept any of these participatory institutions? I've talked to plenty of elected officials, many of them in the United States, and almost 99% of the time the response is, what are you talking about? It's my job to do these things. I make the rules. I got elected, right? I call those people electocrats, right? Because they think they have the right to rule because they've been elected, right? And so the answer to an electocrat, if you're in favor of exploring some of these participatory institutions, is to say, well, you know, your job isn't just to rule because you've been elected, but your job is to advance the values of democracy writ large. And if the fact of elections isn't advancing democratic values, if we can do better, then part of your job involves exploring ways to do better, like convening citizen summits, as Tony Williams did, or maybe experimenting with participatory budgeting, like in Brazil, right? So then the important question is, well, if I'm an elected official or if I'm a citizen trying to decide whether elections are good enough for me or whether we should govern ourselves not just through elections, but with more participation as well, how do I know that? How do I know whether elections are enough or whether we need more than elections, right? And the way that I propose to answer this question is called a kind of pragmatic democracy, right? So a democracy that's not pragmatic kind of fetishizes a particular set of institutions, like read, approaches to democratization literature internationally, or the way a lot of people talk about democracy in the United States. Democracy is identified one-to-one with a particular set of institutions, and that is elections every once in a while, right? Pragmatic democracy says, no, elections or no particular set of institutions is equal to democracy. Democracy is an idea that we can approach more or less well with different kinds of institutions. And we have to play around with that mix because we always should try to be getting closer to the ideal. We shouldn't be happy with where we are. And so the way a pragmatist thinks about democracy is kind of 2 steps. First, there's a diagnosis. What are urgent problem areas in which democracy can do better? Right? So one diagnosis in the United States, you might think, well, it's not very democratic. Incumbents for Congress win 98% of the time. That's probably higher than the incumbent replacement rate in the Chinese Communist Central Party, right? So there's nothing particularly democratic about that. Maybe we should consider that a problem, right? And if that's your diagnosis, then you say, okay, well, what's the prescription? What are other alternatives that are available? Let's look around for those and see if they can do better, okay? So that's a kind of simple 2-step analysis, diagnosis, and prescription for a pragmatist. And so I want to say that democracy, our democracy, a liberal democracy, has 5 important values, right? One is inclusion. If big parts of the population for which government is making decisions can't influence those decisions in any way, then they're excluded. And that's a problem for democracy. Much of the history of Our democracy has been expanding the circle of inclusion to include people without property, to include women, to include black people, to include people under 21 but over 18, maybe someday to include people who've done time in prisons. We'll see, right? So that's inclusion. A second principle is effective consideration of interests. If some people are systematically on the short end of the stick on public policy, that's a problem for democracy. Third principle is equal opportunity for participation. If some people just can't get a seat at the table in an equal way, that's a problem for democracy. Constructive conflict management, right? This is something we're very familiar with in U.S. politics. Maybe there's too much conflict in our politics in some domains. When it's the case that political parties are here and here, and most of the population in public opinion surveys is in the middle, that's a problem. That means that our institutions have, it may mean that our institutions have too much political conflict, and one way to do better is to have institutions that manage that conflict more constructively. And number 5, should be a participatory and deliberative economy. Our institutions shouldn't ask people to devote too much time to politics. Oscar Wilde famously said that the problem with socialism is that it takes too many evenings. We want to be attentive to that concern. Okay. Now, this is a kind of diagnostic tool. The next part of the remarks are a diagnostic tool. And what I would like to say, and what citizens might like to say, what you might like to say to people like Rahm Emanuel or Barack Obama or Adrian Fenty or 99% of American elected officials when they say that there's no place for participation because I got elected, right? The right response is to say, yeah, but right now, in your job, the system of making laws and policies is broken. And participation might help out when it's broken. And here are the ways that it's broken, right? So this is a diagnostic tool of when electocracy is broken in systematic ways, right? So this is electocracy, the second grade civics explanation of how Washington, D.C., or every democratic government from Washington, D.C. to Poughkeepsie works, right? Citizens have interests. They elect politicians to advance those interests. The winner of an election gets a mandate. They make policies, hand them off to public administration, public agencies that then execute those policies with outcomes that hopefully protect the interests of people who elected them, right? That's, if that's not broken, right? If this is electocracy, and if electocracy is not broken, then I think there's no real reason to have, or not much less real reason to have more participatory innovation like the citizen summits that I mentioned earlier. However, there's lots of instances in which electocracy is broken. And so let me give you some characteristic instances. One is unstable preferences. So there's a lot of issues for which people don't really know what they want. So you remember the Tea Party sign, get your government hands off of my Medicare, right? That's a case of unstable preferences because the person who's holding that sign doesn't know whether they want higher taxes for Medicare. They think that they don't, but that's because they don't understand what Medicare is, right? And so sometimes what participatory innovation, especially public deliberation, is meant to do is help people figure those things out, help them make trade-offs inside themselves between tough questions like growth versus environmental protection, high taxes versus better services, right? None of us, or very few of us, really have well-worked-out answers to those difficult trade-offs. We need some institutional space to help us do that work, right? Another problem with electocracy is thin representation. There are lots of issues for which elections create a thin signal, and elected officials don't really know what their constituents, what citizens want, right? I don't know if how many people in this room are old enough to remember the older George Bush. There was a famous news clip of him where he's at a grocery store and he doesn't really understand what a grocery scanner is because he's never bought anything at a grocery store before, right? So this is a case of thin representation. There's too much social distance between the elected official and the constituent, right? Okay, third problem is low accountability. This is what many of the examples of participatory innovation in developing countries are meant to address, right? There's lots of examples, lots of issues in which people are pretty clear about their preferences, officials understand what those preferences are, but the officials want very different things because of the pressures they're under or because their real supporters are a very narrow base of elites rather than the general population, right? This is why it's so hard to get some kinds of industrial financial regulation through in the developed country context. In the developing country context, one version of this is clientelism, right? The mechanism of elections is just too weak to harness the actions of officials to the preferences and views of citizens, right? And then finally, the fourth problem is ineffective government, right? There's lots of issues in which citizens know what they want, politicians know what citizens want, politicians actually want to do the same thing, but the state is just too weak to get that thing done. It doesn't have enough information, it doesn't have enough resources, it doesn't have enough wherewithal, okay? So think about public education. It's unthinkable to me that we could really improve the state of public education just through the tools of bureaucracies, including school bureaucracies. Everybody knows, all the research tells us that what happens at home is a key to whether education happens or not, right? In government, it's a kind of problem where government by itself just can't get the work done. It needs to enlist and mobilize the efforts of, in this case, parents, or to make communities safe in low-income neighborhoods. Government needs to mobilize the efforts of people who live, residents who live in those neighborhoods. That's what the community policing revolution was all about, right? And there's many, many, from environment to all sorts of job training, etc. There's all sorts of issues in which D4, ineffective government, is a problem, right? Okay. And so the general kind of argument, the purpose of this framework is to help citizens, help policymakers understand the places at which electocracy breaks down, and when electocracy breaks down, how different kinds of participatory innovation, different forms of citizen participation might help out by helping citizens articulate their preferences, by thickening up representation, by improving accountability, by making government or public efforts more effective, right? And then we spent a bunch of time over the past day and a half talking about different kinds of participatory innovations and how they might help out with one or other of these problems, right? All right, so just three take-home points. One, which I didn't dwell on, the important values that participation should advance depend on underlying political values in a society. So for social scientists, foundation people, people in development agencies, it's too easy to say, you know, these are the 5 things that participation ought to accomplish, and we want to measure them tomorrow, and then if you do that, we'll give you more money. If you don't do that, we'll take your check away. It's not the right way to think about it. The right way to think about it is to step back a little bit and ask people in those societies what the important values to them are, and then calibrate measurement that way. A second point is that whether or not some participatory reform is desirable depends not just on whether it accomplishes those goals, but whether it improves on the baseline before, right? There's a lot of issues and areas in which electocracy isn't doing all that great. And even if participatory innovation doesn't do everything the people who wrote the proposal claimed it would do, doesn't mean it doesn't do some good, right? Doesn't improve upon that, right? And just think, so I made a big plea over the last day and a half to go a little easier on this whole performance management thing for participation, right? So our elections, imagine that, you know, you're looking at American democracy and you're deciding whether or not to give it another grant for the next year, right? And you realize that American democracy doesn't really increase social justice, leaves a bunch of people out, doesn't really improve services that much. Would you defund it? No. Because you like an American democracy for those reasons, but for a whole other set of reasons as well. Right? Now, that whole set of other reasons should be available to support participatory innovations. Okay? It's just a plea to move back a little bit from performance management and accountability ways of thinking about participatory innovation. And then finally, a simple point. There's lots of different ways to organize citizen participation, and the right ways to organize citizen participation depend on the problem that you're trying to address. So don't think about the participatory innovation first. Participatory innovation is a solution to a problem. Think about the problem first, and then reason through whether or not some design of participation you think will help address that problem. Thank you very much.
So our final speaker, thank you, Archon. Our final speaker is Stephanie McNulty, and I want to give a plug for those of you who came in late. Stephanie has a book, as Blair mentioned at the beginning, called Voice and Vote: Decentralization and Participation in Post-Fujimori Peru, and it was FedExed to the office here yesterday morning, and so she saw her first copy yesterday morning, and I encourage everybody to buy it. Maybe buy it all at the same time so it can rise up on the Amazon list, the top 10.
Yeah.
So.
Put it on your list. Well, thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. Frank mentioned that there are many kinds and many goals of these kinds of institutions that we've been talking about in this conference. And my research focuses on one particular kind of institution, and that's a top-down reform. It combines decentralization reforms with mandated citizen participation. I call these particular kinds of reforms that we're starting to see more and more around the world participatory decentralization reforms. My work focuses on 4 aspects of these particular kinds of reforms. The first part of my research looks at why in the world would a country adopt this kind of reform. Archon asked this question earlier. What could convince an elected official that this is the right thing to do? And decentralization scholars have been sort of struggling with this question for a while, and why would elected government officials give power to local government officials, right? Potentially competing officials, and I argue that it's even more counterintuitive to give power to civil society organizations, right? Not only are they potential competitors, but they can be a completely unknown agent, right? So that's the first one of the issues I look at. A second area of research is why some of the institutions that engage citizens in this governance process work better than others. This becomes immediately apparent when you travel to other countries and see these institutions, see these experiments in several venues. You will know immediately that there's a lot of variance in how these institutions are implemented around even in the same country. In other words, just because a constitution or a Congress might mandate a particular reform, it does not mean that these are taking place at the local level. Okay. The third area of research that I look at is sort of who participates, who actually comes to these meetings, these fora. Once up and running, do they actually do they reach newer constituencies? Do they reach the disempowered communities in these different states and regions and towns? Or is it just sort of the same old elite actors, political parties, and government officials dominating the fora? And finally, my work looks at the impact of these particular kinds of institutions. So today what I want to do is tell you about 2 areas of research, to the first 2 questions in my own research, and I'll present some findings. And I'm also happy to discuss in the discussion the other 2 areas as well. Before I get to the findings, I wanted to mention why I think Peru is an important case. It's important for 2 reasons. It expands the literature on participatory governance in these 2 ways. First of all, it's a top-down mandated reform. A lot of our knowledge about participatory governance comes from cases where these were organically created at the local level after decentralization reforms empowered these communities. So we might ask ourselves, will we see different experiences in these top-down processes? The second reason I think Peru is an interesting case is because it's a country with very weak political parties. So this is not a party project, right? And I think that becomes important. I'll come back to this when I talk about my findings. Okay, so what are my findings? I said I'll talk briefly about my findings regarding the first 2 research questions that I mentioned, and I actually have some policy recommendations as well that I develop in the book. And actually, I was going to pause here and say I completely empathize, with a lot of you in the room, because I too worked in policy for years before going back and getting a PhD and becoming a professor. And I remember coming to these types of things thinking, but how can this help my program? It's great that you can research this your whole life, but can you just give me a little nugget that could make my program a little bit better? So I promise that I will try to do that, but I have to, because I am now a professional, scholar, I have to give you the findings as well. So the first question, why PDRs, right? I mean, we've talked a lot about the explicit goals of these kinds of reforms, right? Of course, every law has this flowery language about everything that this reform will accomplish. But we've also talked about these sort of hidden implicit goals that are going on once you look beyond that law. What I have found is that you will, just like most of the literature suggests, a lot of the decentralization reforms are happening after some sort of crisis, and I actually call this an opportunity structure. I don't think this is causal, but I think it opens up the space for this kind of radical reform. And I don't mean radical as in sort of like hippie leftist reform. I mean something that really changes the structure of government, right? In the case of Peru, it's the fall of Alberto Fujimori, increasingly dictatorial over a 10-year regime, increasingly corrupt. And there was a crisis facing Peruvian lawmakers in 2001 and 2002. And in other countries as well, you will tend to see this emerging at this sort of moment of crisis. But beyond that, really, it also confirms a lot of our knowledge about this in the sense that these are domestic electoral strategies that are driving these reforms. National level political actors, in the case of Peru, it was Alejandro Toledo, Alan Garcia, wanted this to go forward, right? And so there's a large role for agents in this process as well. Now, more interestingly, I think for this particular conference is why was it so participatory, right? And three factors help us understand that particular outcome. The idea that in Peru's constitution, the national level reformers wrote in a mandate that citizens have to be consulted in X, Y, and Z ways throughout the year and throughout the planning process. And again, going back to Archon's presentation, I would argue that if you look at this series of decisions and events that have to happen in electrocracy, all of those links were broken in this case, right? I mean, and that allows, again, it opens up the space for this particular kind of reform. Not only did the transition to democracy in Peru open up public space for this kind of reform, but it also brought agents, it brought civil society activists and former mayors to national level politics to push this reform through Congress. And I think that may be idiosyncratic to Peru, the case of Peru, as well as some historical factors that you could read about in the book. But there are also some very interesting institutional dynamics going on in this particular case, and I suspect that may travel to other cases. In this case, the Ministry of Finance actually pushed this reform, designed this reform, and pushed this reform through Congress, and designed a mandatory participatory budget process at state, county, and local levels. And so this led to what one scholar called, when I was there, leading Peru to become the most participatory country in the world, right? Because at every year, hundreds of cities are undertaking this participatory budget process, and they don't receive their money from the central government unless they can prove that they have, at least minimally met the legal requirements. Okay, so that's the first piece of why in the world would politicians decide to do this kind of reform. The second piece is why are some of these experiences more successful than others? I went to 6 regions in Peru and observed several participatory institutions. And I think my findings are just as interesting in terms of what did not matter as they are in terms of what did matter when I was trying to understand the success of these experiences. So in terms of what did matter, again, a lot of what some of the scholarship had told, and we knew, especially from Brazil. Design, even though the design does exist at the national level, there was some room for some innovation, but also some manipulation, right? And so in some regions that I visited, there were some really exciting things going on beyond the national mandate. But in some regions that I visited, there was some restriction of citizen participation, right? And so you could see both. So design does matter, but it is not insurmountable. I think that's the message I have in the book. The other factor that is incredibly important is what I call a virtuous cycle of participation. And this is made up of 2 pieces. Leaders, regional leaders who are committed to the process, and an organized and collaborative civil society sector. This is an interactive cycle. It is a dynamic cycle, right? One cannot exist without the other. What's interesting as well about this particular aspect is that a lot of us had assumed previously that only leftist parties or leftist political leaders are promoting these kinds of innovations, and that's not true. In the case of Peru, these leaders fall along the ideological spectrum. Different leaders support these processes for different reasons. Ideology, maybe. But electoral strategizing also was a very strong motivating factor behind their support. The least effective are the populists, the presidents, the regional governors, who said to me, "Oh, God, this whole participation thing, it's a waste of time. I'm just going to have a big town hall meeting and ask people what they want," right? They didn't want to ask people what they want. They wanted to have a little FaceTime with their constituents. So they wanted to bypass the participatory institutions and get to larger number of constituents. What didn't matter in the Peru case is interesting, I think. It's not more money. The richer regions, when measured per capita, were not more participatory. And again, it wasn't only leftist politicians either. And finally, we don't need decades of experience building social capital. I looked at sort of the pre-reform and the post-reform civil society sector and found that in some successful cases, there were consortia. There was a regional consortium formed after the reform as a result of this particular reform, right? So it goes against some of the arguments about social capital that we had especially heard sort of in the mid '90s. Robert Putnam and his study on Italy, for example. Okay. So I promised to get to the recommendations, so I will go there. I do have some thoughts on the third and fourth question about, the impact of these kinds of reforms and who is participating. But for now, let me get to hopefully what might make your life a little bit easier at some moment. And the first policy recommendation is, to the extent that is possible, we need to pay attention to design. In Peru, reformers were very rushed. The president said, make this happen now. And a lot of the problems with the reform were a direct result of that timing. And so to the extent that, international donors and international NGOs have the capacity or the power to affect the timing, we need to encourage our counterparts to slow down. We need clear and binding incentives. We need the participatory budget in Peru is especially successful, and again, I can talk about how I'm measuring success as well. I'm happy to do that. Because there are annual instructions, and a region cannot receive its money until they have complied minimally with the instructions. And the third piece of design is that they are flexible. There's an inherent flexibility built into the process. The Ministry of Finance convenes actors every year to ask for feedback and then updates the annual instructions. Right? And so there's a clear structure in the design. There's an incentive in the design, but they've also built in some flexibility. Of course, I'm not saying that this is a perfect process by any means, but it is something for us to think about in designing these institutions. And we also want to lower the barriers to participation. In the case of Peru, civil society organizations are invited to this particular kind of participatory institution. And one issue that has prevented the equitable participation is the stipulation that only formal organizations can participate. And this is a country that is incredibly informal in nature in terms of market, in terms of politics. And so this just doesn't prevents a lot of very important actors who you want to bring to the table from coming to the table. My second set of recommendations is that we need to think of ways, and this is a challenge, but we need to think of ways to foster and then strengthen that virtuous cycle. Okay? So remember, there are two pieces to the cycle: the leaders and the civil society sector. One of the important pieces about leadership is that we can convince leaders that this is something that can serve their interests, right? This can be an instrumental institution. Now, obviously, we don't want to. We're hoping that this is not the corrupt leader. That the way it serves their interests is that they can, find a way to steal $5,000 from the local bank, right? But in a way that, if we're convinced that this is the right thing to do in a certain environment, we can work with leaders to convince them that this can be a strategic tool. It's harder in terms of civil society organizations. I worked in civil society strengthening for years, and I know how complicated these sectors are at the local level. These are people who have known each other and hated, and worked together and been disappointed in each other and fought with each other for years. But to some extent, we need to try to foster collaborative mechanisms. And the last point I have is that we also somehow need to deal with the costs of participation, right? As one of my interviewees said, participation makes you poor, right? And so we need to somehow find a way to offset those costs. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie. We realize we have about a half an hour left for the planned session. And I just wanted to run through a couple of key ideas that were talked about over the last day and a half and lay them out, and to give the people in the room an idea of some of the issues that we talked about. A key distinction, the first one is a key distinction was made over whether these programs are induced or organic. And organic, it's a combination of civil society and political society, parties or politicians who are involved in adopting the programs. In the induced, it's either by the national constitution or by donors or by potentially by political parties that we begin to see very different motivations for people being involved. So when we think about participatory governance, we need to separate along, we need to sort of think about it analytically along those terms. We also need to think about two of the more successful countries that are often cited, Brazil and India, are actually mixed cases of organic and induced. You have this combination. At particular moments, it may be an idea that starts locally and then spreads out. It's induced through parties, or you have the diffusion of ideas through social movements or some other mechanisms. A second issue that was really clear, and Stephanie in all three presentations mentioned this, is we need to be very clear about what the incentives are for politicians and state officials to delegate authority to citizens. I mean, it's counterintuitive that somebody elected in representative democracy is going to devolve authority, but what we see numerous examples of politicians being willing to do that. So we need to think about, be very clear about what the participatory institution can provide elected officials. If and when politicians perceive that it's in their both short-term interest in terms of election, but as well as part of a larger political project to transform society or to build support, you have more likely that politicians and government officials are going to be supportive. A third area that we talked about to think about is that participatory governance is oftentimes, in Archon's issue of frustration, is that they are adopted in moments of crisis. And many institutions in moments of crisis don't work well. And so we shouldn't really, if you think about, in the Fujimori case, when you have a collapse of authority, when you have the state that's not working, we need to back off a little bit about what Archon was arguing for and have a lower threshold for what we think of as the impact of these programs. Now, to this, we also have to think about that failure, and this is going to be hard for policymakers. This is a theme that came up repeatedly, is that failure should be expected. And it's the success is actually more exceptional in the sense that what we see is that governments, as are going along, begin to adapt. They begin to change the rules. They begin to change the incentive structure for citizens as well as for their bureaucrats. So we need to think about how we can incorporate the idea of failure as being part of the process, that there's going to be shortcomings. One of the issues that this then raises for me is this point of overselling. Too often we see that participatory governance is oversold. It's supposed to solve far more problems, and it's oversold to citizens. You need to come because your lives are going to be transformed, or you can change your neighborhood, change your community. And oftentimes, the type of effects are much lower than people's expectations. But that's also true for donor agencies. I mean, people who are who are providing the resources, they oftentimes oversell this to the governments in terms of what can be achieved. But oftentimes you have a much lower level of outcome produced rather than a broad transformation of people's lives. Another area that we discussed that is really important to think about is how these institutions modify representative democracy. That representative democracy in many places is political parties and politicians are, as Archon was talking about, is having a very difficult time aggregating citizens' interests, identifying the signals. And what we can see is these participatory institutions are changing the aggregation methods. They're changing the signals that are being sent from local, from community levels through the government. And what this means is that we can think about new types of networks are being created. So you have networks in which citizens who have traditionally been excluded find themselves having access to a policy network, or they find themselves being able to get constituency service. Rather than having to rely on clientelism, they can now identify the public agency that is possible, that's supposed to attend to their needs. One of the things that we talked about a lot over the last day and a half is sort of, how do we measure impact? How do we think about the perception of what role these plays? And it was an idea that was very clear is that when we're measuring impact, we need to keep it within the goals of the particular program. We need to figure out what the program was intended to do, but that there's oftentimes, it was identified, there's oftentimes two different types of outcomes that are measured. Empowerment in terms of learning capabilities. In that sense, numbers matter far less, number of participants, and what matters more is how people's behaviors, people's perceptions might be changed by the process. The second area is to think about policy improvements. If the program actually was designed to change policy, within the policy stream, either decrease resource leakage or to allocate more resources in a low-income village or low-income community. Did that in fact happen? A little bit sort of, when I want to sort of raise an issue to push back a little bit on Archon, is I think there are extremely high expectations associated with these institutions, and that we need to think about that is, we need to develop the the tools and the evidence to show whether this is the best use of people's times and resources. I mean, I've been looking at these for 15 years, and you ask me, depends on the time of the day, and depends on the program, and depends on where is the response. There's not a clear, definitive, I think, body of evidence that shows that that this is in fact the way to modify how the state works, to modify how citizens engage the state. Let me stop there and open it up for questions.
I'm Johanna Bachman, and I just one word I didn't hear being spoken. Would you considering the history of?
We're going to get you a microphone. Yeah.
Johanna Bachman. A word I didn't hear in the discussion is socialism, because the original discussion of participatory democracy came out of Velasco's Peru as one example. There were many forms of socialist movements that were very anti-Soviet coming out of Peru and Chile, and when that makes me think about, well, what is the relationship between participatory democracy and forms of economic reform? It wouldn't be the Soviet Union in any way, but when Archon put up that frame that said participatory economy, I was thinking we were going to talk about the economy, but we're actually talking that was efficiency or something like that. But Archon's co-author Eric Olin Wright would go in this direction and talk about markets and economic reform as related to participatory democracy. So I want to know the connections, if there are any.
Before we let's take a couple of questions before we respond, and Blair pointed out that in fact the session is supposed to go to 3:30, not just till 3. So I was trying to rush through, but we have a little more time for questions and responses. So I think Tulia, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I did.
Your microphone is behind you.
So my first question is for Archon. One of your points towards the end of the presentation was that the baseline for performance evaluation should be thought carefully about, because it's not always clear that time or conditions should lead to the results that are expected. But I was wondering, what other things could we be looking at that performance evaluations are not looking as perhaps positive results from participatory experiences? Is it social capital, and if so, how do we measure it? Is other forms of collaboration? Is some spillover effects? Is a change in normative values? I don't know. You might have some ideas on that. And then I wanted to see if Stephanie would elaborate on the who are participating. It's interesting that in the literature on electoral participation, on political electoral participation, we see that the who are more likely to participate are rich, middle class, educated. That's not the case with the type of policy participation that you analyze. So I wanted to know who are more likely to participate, and also whether prior politicization, prior political experience made a big difference for those actors, either leaders or actors in civil society that are part of the virtuous cycle. And if you have time, or if we all have time, a little bit about the effects too would be nice.
Thank you. Right, go ahead. There's a microphone that.
Thank you. Joe Nelson, AU. The differences in forms were emphasized. I wonder whether we could hear a little bit about interactions, interplay between different contexts, particularly political contexts, and effective forms. And more on forms, I would be very interested to hear some examples or analysis of forms that move outside of the budget allocation context. Budget allocation has a lot of, it's very important, but it has some characteristics which are rather different from other kinds of policy and public issues.
Let's take one more question in the back, and then we'll turn it over to.
Thank you. I'm wondering if the panel can point to cases in which political parties have developed and promoted participatory governance systems. My name is Sam Downing with National Democratic Institute, and I'm also wondering whether there, in the different findings from your research, particularly for Professor McNulty, whether different policy areas have brought about different outcomes in terms of participatory governance, and whether some issues are sort of just too technical to be incorporated, particularly urban planning, some of the more technical issues in urban planning. Thanks.
How do you want to do this? Do you want to start, Frank, or Archon? Stephanie?
Go ahead. Oh, just 2 points. In the case of India, it was actually the Communist Party which introduced a famous set of reforms in Kerala, India, called People's Planning Campaign, and that's another form of non-budgeting thing, which was quite interesting because experts and citizens came together and figured out a collaborative way to assess the resources in a particular area that worked quite well, and then became the basis. That information became the basis for deliberative fora.
Archon?
Yeah, these are great questions. To Joanna's question on the economy and production, I guess I view them as parallel investigations. So democratization in the political realm, which is mostly what we've been talking about, of state powers and capacities, proceeds along a certain logic. And then I know Eric has been looking a lot at social economy kinds of dynamics and experiments in Montreal and other places. But that's an investigation about alternative forms of production that might be more just and more democratic in the economic democracy kind of sense. And I think it's extremely important. However, a slightly different set of questions that's likely to involve different dynamics that take into account the logic of production in a very different way. And so, I wish that the kind of older literature on cooperatives and non-hierarchical forms was alive and well and going, but it's just not. I mean, except for a very, very few number of scholars working in that domain. I think there's a number of people working on how very modern forms of production involve some kind of flat team-based cellular production kind of things that have some arguably democratic characteristics, but that's a little bit more of a stretch, I think. But I think it's a really important thing to look at. I think there's lots to look at. There are a lot of cooperative forms of production out there that are not the subject of huge amounts of investigation. So it's not that the phenomenon is absent, it's that the scholarship is absent. And on the what we should be looking for question and measurement, I guess I'm a little bit of a skeptic of impact measurement in social policy, and especially, I mean, it's hard enough to do just for a flat-out social policy, right? I mean, do we know that more per pupil spending in an education context helps? I think the evidence goes both ways. Smaller classrooms, the evidence goes both ways, right? So even, things that you think you should be able to discern big effects, the evidence goes both. Why? Because the organizations and institutions, there's a lot of noise going on there, right? And so to think that a process innovation like this could move the HDI dial, needle on the HDI dial or something, it seems a little bit, heroic to me as an empirical matter and a social scientific matter. I guess how I do some of my own work and the kind of work that I like to read is looking at how these reforms and initiatives modify political processes and organizational processes, and then inductively, be able to to tell a story or get a sense about how things are changing at the organizational level, that, given a full context and a full story about the 20 different things that need to be in place, how that will result in a different process of allocation or the production of social services or social problem solving, right? So so I guess the plea here is to look at intermediate kinds of changes that go on, to look at a process and path tracing kind of dynamic, and then to kind of reason about what the final effects or the impacts that you're interested in down the line, down the causal chain, are likely to be. Because I guess I just think that measuring the impacts directly, we just haven't been so successful with that, even though people keep insisting on doing it.
Stephanie?
Right. So thank you. These are great questions. I want to start with a question about socialism, and what's, I think, really interesting about that in the case of Peru is that, much like Latin America in general, the left, of course, sort of fell apart after the end of the Cold War. Unlike parts of Latin America, the left has not been able to reorganize, right? Of course, we see the rise of the left in parts in many countries, and the reemergence of the left. And that is directly related to the shining path, I think, right? What we don't see much, what I didn't observe is any discourse about socialism. What I did see, which fascinates me, is a lot about corporatism, right? And so when you talk about Velasco, that is his legacy, right, is the institutionalization of corporate bodies. And so this particular reform that I'm studying is equally corporatist. It invites civil society organizations to the table. And this actually gets to the question about forms, additional forms as well. I was, in my book, I look at beyond participatory budgeting. I also look at what are called regional coordination councils. And this particular institution, it took me months to understand where in the world this idea came from, because it mixes. It's equal to the regional council, like a city council mechanism, but it brings 60% of the members of this particular body, the Regional Coordination Council, are elected civil society organizations, representatives of elected civil society organizations, and 40% are elected mayors from the provinces. Okay, I know. I mean, again, it took me months to understand even that much. So I wouldn't expect you to take that home. But again, I kept asking people, what in the world inspired you to create this? It just makes no sense. And it was, back to the corporatist history that is very strong in Peru, and again, in many Latin American countries. I'll continue with the form, and, so I can't answer your question about socialism, but I did find that fascinating. I'll continue a little bit more about forms. These particular councils are tasked with accepting the participatory budgets and developing regional plans, regional development plans, which those of you who study the developing world know that these are very sort of popular way of developing strategic or long-term plans for the region. So I don't talk about them as much because they were not very successful, not because of their necessarily the corporatist nature, but more because of design issues in the law. So, but they were modeled after the citizen councils that were passed as part of the popular participation law in Bolivia. So there are actual many forms, and I would hate for you all to leave this room thinking that we only study participatory budgets, because that is not the case at all, right? Archon's book has several examples of very interesting institutions that engage citizens. Tulia, which is, by the way, it's very nice to. we've emailed before, but I've never met you in person. Who? I would love to talk about who is participating. Thank you so much for asking that question. I'll try to make it short. Who is participating, and do they have some sort of prior political experience? And I think that question relates very much to the very extensive research on Brazil, who has participated in the participatory budgets in Brazil. We know that in Brazil they have become pretty equitable fora. Women, poor, and uneducated are attending at relatively good rates. This is not so in Peru. It leads me to start to generate maybe a working hypothesis that maybe these top-down reforms are not, they may be more susceptible to elite capture. I mean, that is something that demands much more future research. For example, what I've been looking at particularly is women's participation. As we know, those of us who study Latin America know that women historically have not had access to the public sphere on an equal level, especially in non-urban areas. In fact, in these regional level fora, only 2 to 3% of the organizations attending represent women's organizations. So, you know, I think this issue should be especially important to donor organizations, because whether our organizations are implicitly or explicitly or even accidentally promoting these kinds of reforms, we need to be aware of who is attending, who are we reaching. And I think the ramifications of non-participation are also very important. In other words, in our cases where we do not have diversity of participation, I would argue that we have a bias in policy outcome, right? So the projects that are funded, the development plans that are funded are going to be biased towards a particular perspective, right? And that is the participant's perspective. And so if we do not have indigenous women, campesinos, and Afro-Latinos, we do not even have the opportunity to incorporate their perspective into these projects.
I want to jump in and try to answer Joan's question about spaces beyond participatory budgeting, because there's something different about budgeting than other processes. And where I want to return to, and this sort of goes back to the question about socialism and socialist parties, is during the transition from military rule to democratic rule in Brazil, it was the Socialist Party and movements who had sort of reconceptualize what socialism could be, who sought to restructure the state and by mandating that participation be established. So you have, to use Eleanor Ostrom's language, you have the Constitution now requires participation, but it also permits participation. And in terms of the permitting participation, we have these public policy management councils. And what the public policy management council, we think there's 30 to 40,000 of these management councils, probably 300,000 people who are elected to these councils across the country. What is their impact? What is their role? And they have sort of these dual responsibilities of oversight as well as policy. To advocate policy. So it creates a contradictory set of incentives for citizen participants, because on the one hand, they're supposed to be advocating policies, but then they're supposed to be monitoring the government. And as they monitor the government, if they start raising their hands, they lose their policies. So what we see in the context, though, is we now have these were set in motion in a moment in which Brazil has a fragmented but also a credible state. The Brazilian state, in terms of developing state, does an incredible amount. I mean, this is a state that launches satellites. This is a state that at one point was building airplanes before they privatized. So we have it's part of the process that I think it's making state commitment credible. It's making the state act in ways that reflect, respond to popular demand. Going back to this participation issue, in work that I did a few years ago, what I found is that in urban areas, we had high levels of women participation, but as you go to mid-sized cities where you didn't have the political and civil society renewal of the 1980s, you have these spaces dominated by men. So it's 70-30, so it's not that much different than the Peruvian cases that Stephanie is talking about. There was a question earlier about urban planning, and in fact, urban planning is an area that has, in the context of Brazil, in which there has been extensive effort to incorporate citizen into the policymaking process. And there's a whole series of design tools that are used by governments as well as by NGOs that allow for and actually require citizen voice and participation for the redesign of shanty towns or the introduction of new public works. That has to do with the social movement history in Brazil, but it's also interesting, under President Lula, they passed a law that required that cities adopt participatory programs in urban planning, which have the effect of requiring citizen participation at the local levels via national level mandate, which reminds me a lot of what President Johnson and the Great Society did with the Metropolitan Planning Organization. The MPOs have a very similar, you try to encourage participation by requiring these sorts of mechanisms. And Blair had...
Yeah, no, I wanted to amplify the urban planning. Urban planning became participatory before people used the term participatory. Beginning with the paradigm shift with Jane Jacobs and how planners are trained. A colleague of mine who's a very senior faculty member in planning at Berkeley starts out entering classes of graduate students saying, if you came here to think you're studying design, you're wrong. You will become community facilitators. And we see over and over again in the United States how the whole planning process has changed. The largest urban planning project in the country right now is the remake of the Brooklyn waterfront. That has taken as long as it's taken because of extensive community involvement and consultation. The whole Barcelona model, which 10 years ago was getting a big ride, was all about community participation. And unfortunately, Eduardo Rojas just left, but he spent his whole career promoting community participation in urban planning in Latin America. So urban planning is actually a very good example of how the paradigm shift can be implemented to incorporate citizens, even though really this began to happen well before the term participation became in vogue.
Frank?
Yes, I'd like to add a slight caveat to Blair's remarks. I teach in a planning school. It's one of my activities, and while this is true, it's not uncontested. There's a tremendous divide between those who think we should be teaching technical skills and believe that those of us who are talking about deliberation, participation, are sort of twiddling our fingers, wasting our time, and there have been some quite acrimonious debates even in the literature about this. But it definitely has a strong presence, which is why they are so upset.
Open it up and see if there's other questions.
Hi, I'm Susan Celaya from the International Republican Institute. I know you said you worked a lot with CSOs, and I have a question. Because when we go to work in these municipalities with these communities on things like the participatory budgeting, like citizen transparency commissions, you see the same representatives of CSOs at all of these meetings. And so I'm just wondering if you have any experience in getting more people involved.
Hi, my name is Lane Benjamin. I'm a faculty member at George Mason, but my research focuses on civil society organizations and accountability, and I was trained as a planner at Cornell with John Forrester. So my question is really about this issue of civil society organizations, and in my experience, there's this kind of dual legitimacy thing that they face, and part of unpacking concept around democratic governance is really looking at the role of funders and the role that they play in setting the agenda of these organizations. And having worked in South Africa during the democratic transition, what I saw a lot of is organizations wrestling with this dual legitimacy of trying to, in one sense, be a watchdog in regards to the state, and at the other sense, being called to question around their own legitimacy and right to speak on behalf of those people that they worked with. And we know that nonprofits are more or less effective on that front in terms of representing folks that they are supposed to serve. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the role of private philanthropy in this whole conversation of democratic governance, because it does set the stage around a lot of things as well.
My name's Johnny Latesta. I'm a student at George Mason University, and I was wondering, particularly Stephanie, if you could elaborate a little more on your definition of success, and to the panel in general, kind of how to conceptualize success and failure within these institutions, especially considering I think Arjun's statement that failure should be incorporated as kind of part of the process. And also, if anyone can elaborate a little bit on how to think about success and failure in terms of a process versus success and failure in terms of an outcome.
Take one more question. Is there anything else, or should we? Stephanie, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with the last question. I think that one is the most directly towards my work. I mean, I have a very minimal definition of success, and until yesterday, I think I worried about that until Archon made his presentation, and I decided that that's okay because it is true. So thank you.
Yeah.
Right. Well, no, I mean, his point that are we expecting too much, right? And I think the example you gave yesterday, I can't remember exactly what it is, but if we elect someone, do we expect them to, provide better services, engage us every day in decision making, et cetera, et cetera? No, right? So again, to answer the question, it's a pretty minimal definition. It's a very, unfortunately, again, it's mostly process oriented, and I would much rather eventually develop some outcome oriented indicators of success. Basically, I was interested in, did these organizations meet? Did the meetings happen, and did people show up, right? And I would love to look at so many other aspects, and especially the kind of participation that happens once you're there, right? But the only way to do that is to actually be in the meetings over and over again, observe them, document them over a long period of time. So I wasn't able to do that, but in my interviews and in some observations, I could, at least acknowledge that the meetings happened, people showed up, and projects were approved, or the development budget was approved. Now, a nice thing about the other form I was studying, the Citizen Council, is I could also look at recommendations. Were recommendations made to governors, and did the governors and councils accept the recommendations? So that was another indicator I used in that case as well. I have not been able to think, I would love to think about it more, but I have not been able to develop my own way to measure longer term outcome sort of indicators. I have some ideas, but it wasn't possible in this case.
And let me jump in here, because this is an issue that I tried to I published a book 3 or 4 years ago on participatory budgeting, 8 cases in Brazil, and I tried to tackle this issue. And the idea for the book came out of sort of traveling and seeing different cases, and people assuming that their case wasn't as good as Porto Alegre, but they were having different types of experiences that sort of this wide variation in the quality of outcomes. And some of the things that I tried to do in this particular case, because it's budgeting and you have specific public works, is I tried to link what was included in the annual budget and what was implemented to try to show a connection there. And so I was able to show, for example, in Porto Alegre, there's about $400 or $500 million US that were allocated, that were spent by the government based on decisions made by citizens. In Belo Horizonte, over the last 12 years, it's been about the same. They spent $600-700 million US on programs selected by citizens. Another thing to sort of measure success is I did a survey among leaders, and I asked individuals, do you think I asked a whole series about questions about the power and the authority they think they held. And what I found is that there was a very strong correlation between the power that they think they held and the amount of resources that the government had spent in the program. So that, in fact, when people say, no, we don't have any power, we have no authority, it matched up with the experience. Because it wasn't just this notion of, we're here, we're participating, it's fine. It's when you ask them, do you have authority, that came up, it's very hot, it's a strong correlation. The other issue that I wanted to touch on is this issue of legitimacy. I can't really touch the funder issue because funders are pulling out of Brazil for the reasons of Brazil is now such a wealthy country. I mean, in relative terms to a lot of its neighbors in other places in the developing world. But the legitimacy problem that develops is that we now expect civil society organizations to mobilize their community and to engage in incremental policy-making processes. And those are two really different sets of skills, and it makes it difficult. And so when community leaders have to learn all these different policies and how to get things done, it takes away their capacity to energize and organize individuals, which then brings us to this issue of why is it always the same people at these meetings? And there are institutional designs to have renewal, where you can, you know, you have a 1-year limit or you have a 2-year limit. But what I came to discover is when you put those limits in, you oftentimes created a bias against civil society because you had no institutional memory. You were always having to learn from scratch. And having the same representatives at meetings it's the carriers of democracies. I mean, if you think about the United States, who carries democracy? It's a small number of individuals. It's not the average citizen, but you rely on these representatives. Now, the relationship between the representative and the citizen, of course, is complicated, you know, issues of how representative the individual who claims to represent a group actually is. But I've come to sort of change my thinking on this, and that having the same person knowing a lot and advocating on behalf of their community actually gives that community an incredible power to confront and engage the state, confront and engage different organizations. Let me turn it over, Archon, and then or Frank or Archon. Or
Again, 3 really good questions. So I'll interpret the CSO question in a narrow way, and that's as the usual suspects problem, right? Why are we only seeing the usual suspects at these meetings? And 2 responses. One is builds on Brian's. Whether or not that actually is a problem depends, again, on what the problem is that you're trying to solve, democratically speaking, right? If it's a low accountability problem, and what you need is kind of strong civil society organizations that you have some confidence are really representative to be a kind of counterweight, countervailing power with regard to the state, then maybe the usual suspects is not a problem, right? But sometimes for other kinds of problems, the usual suspects definitely is a problem, right? So if the issue is that politicians or government feels like they only hear from organized interests and would like some broader view, some broader access to what other kinds of citizens think, then the usual suspects is a problem, and you got to get other folks at the table. And there's lots of ways to do that, right? The usual suspects show up when the way that you invite people to a meeting is open and therefore self-selected. But there are other ways of selecting and recruiting people to go to these things, up to and including random selection, right? Which I think shouldn't be at all dismissed for particular kinds of problems. One interesting solution I saw to the usual suspects problem I ran into in Minneapolis, and there they had kind of a neighborhood governance system, but part of the deal for being able to participate was that these neighborhood organizations had to have a participation plan in which they wrote down who they thought they weren't getting to the neighborhood meeting and what steps they were taking to try to reach out to those subgroups in the community. Like, okay, not very many Somalis show up to the neighborhood general assembly, and so here's our Somali outreach plan, and here's whether or not we got them, right? So putting the ball back in the court, which sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. On the role of private philanthropy, I think that's a big issue, and I think that the double accountability, both those faces of accountability are really important, right? And so there's a guy at Syracuse at the Maxwell School. I can't remember his name right now, but he surveyed a bunch of the executives of international NGOs on this accountability question. And one question was, who do you think you should be accountable to, right? And the answer is always beneficiaries, right? People in the affected communities. And then they asked a whole other series of questions about how they actually spent their time in accountability, who they actually answered to. And of course, it was donors and boards, right? It was not at all the beneficiaries. So that's a huge mismatch in themselves, right? In who they think they should be accountable to and who they actually are accountable to. And that's a huge problem that needs to be resolved, one way or another. Because the current lines of accountability just are not working in that regard. And then finally, on success and failure, I guess, maybe I put the point a little too strongly. It's always important to try to measure whether, or try to come to some sort of judgment about whether some intervention or some program or some policy, some initiative is moving the ball forward, democratically speaking, right? And so for me, it's those 5 values that were on that slide about inclusion, equal consideration of interests, opportunities to participate, principled conflict management, et cetera, right? And you can arrive at judgments about whether an intervention is helping out on any of those dimensions or not, or actually moving the ball backward. I just want to push toward a more nuanced way of evaluating, right? It's just going to be hard to come to some gold standard, either randomized controlled trial or some sort of quantitative measurement of this institutional intervention in short order. But it is important to try to understand and make an argument about for yourself and for other people about whether or not any progress is being made. And for me, that's what counts as success and failure. But for your list will be different.
Frank?
Yes. With regard to success and failure, it's becomes apparent that lots of things are going on, and it depends on, in part, on who you ask in determining whether or what the goals are and whether they were succeeded or not. One that tends to fall out or get downplayed because it's very difficult to measure is the fact that citizens or participants often learn communicative skills and political strategies in the course of these activities. And these are difficult to measure, but they have to have, should have, I think have some indirect impact on the quality of democracy. And we actually offer our citizens too few fora for this kind of genuine engagement. It's not strategic. That's something we shouldn't forget. It's easy to forget because we don't know exactly how to measure that. Although any number of projects quote citizens who said, housewives and really normal everyday people say, I didn't know I could do this. But now I'm going to all the meetings and I'm talking back to those guys. It's quite a fairly common outcome.
If I could just jump in on Frank's point. Last year I did a study in Belo Horizonte. I was there for a year, and I identified 4,000 different elected positions for citizens at the local, regional, and municipal level. So you had this incredible network of engagement among citizens where they were able to work with the state. And one of the ideas that sort of came at me that I hadn't noticed, 5 years or 10 years ago, is that people were using the language in one space that was developed in another space. So there was this communications, there was these values, and they were justifying why and how money should be spent in one area based on the rules in another area. They were also talking about how when somebody would bring up an issue and say, no, that's not this council, that's not this space, you need to go here. So there's this education among the citizens about how to pursue their interests. And that really didn't happen 10 or, that didn't happen 15 years ago when these were starting out, but it's part of the process now. And Stephanie wanted to...
Really briefly, in terms of just building on the who attends and how to expand that, I think there's some very specific things that can be done in the case, in the context of a developing country. Send a call for participation out in the appropriate language, right? I mean, you want to have in Peru, you have, and through the radio, okay? So a lot of organizations will, or the government will actually put out its mandatory notice that this is happening in maybe the local newspaper, right? I mean, how many people can you possibly reach that way? So few, right? So language is important. The medium of the notification is important. Transportation costs. This is an incredible barrier to participation, okay? So how do we do that without inviting clientelism and capture and corruption? That's a challenge. It's something that we have to solve. Some organizations insist on being invited personally. This is true. I would go to the Chamber of Commerce, and of course, every governor wants the Chamber of Commerce at their meeting, and they never come. And so they said, "Well, I don't know. The president didn't invite me." Of course, because you need to show up and give a personal invitation. If you do, that's not a bad idea in some cases. Time of day. We have to do more research on what time of day gets more people there, especially rural farmers and/or women. Childcare. Okay, and the final one that I was forced to think about is disabled. There was a Association of Handicapped organization in the Amazon. Okay, how could they get into a building? So those are just some really specific, easy ways to get more people involved. The question of legitimacy, it's a super complicated issue, and NGOs play a really important role in my successful cases, and I'm actually not very critical of that role because, yes, they don't have constituents. Yes, they're not necessarily legitimized in the sense of having voting members, having paying members, but my sense is that they're pretty committed to local development, right? And so I have a lot more on that, and I actually have an article I could share about that role, about that issue, about who is, what kinds of organizations are benefiting from this and why.
We have about 10 minutes left. Additional questions?
I'm Leanne Fuji from the University of Toronto. This is not my area of research, so I'll just preface my remarks. I'm just wondering if all participation is equal or if more participation is always good. So I can think of two scenarios whereby more participation would be a legitimizing strategy for elites, i.e. more, where participation is really a reflection of local big men or strong men who have more or less coerced participation. And then I can think of a situation where lower participation is indicative of better governance. The more efficient the institutions become, why go? They're working pretty well. Why do I need to give up all my evenings and weekends, to sort of when everything's kind of working the same? So that was just a general question to the whole panel.
My question is sort of related. You're all very enthusiastic about this, and participation I can understand in a zoning or an urban planning case where it's my street, my neighborhood, I've got a direct interest. But we elect governments to make trade-offs among things that we don't care about, short-term, long-term, other neighborhoods, people I don't care about. And I haven't heard you talk about how any of this work feeds into changing the more formal institutions that will sustain the demise of the NGOs that aren't funded anymore, or the change in the elected leader who tolerates the participation. But how do you embed these things in more formal structures that indeed make it so we don't have to worry about how the water is delivered in our neighborhood?
Take a last question.
This actually isn't a question, but it's just a comment. I have been following reform efforts in education and health for some years and the politics thereof. The ex-Minister of Education of Colombia, who holds a record of staying 8 years in office, and before that 4 years as the Secretary of Education in Bogota, spoke recently at Inter-American Dialogue. One of her remarks is pertinent here. She talked about the tremendous potential of computers and the internet for participation, for input, including the putting online draft decrees of the Ministry of Education, and inviting comment from all and sundry. Happens also to be a good way to get around union obstructionism. and to get to teachers and parents and others. So it's just, I've been sitting here thinking about the broader array of opportunities for participation in a variety of sectors, sort of going beyond the kinds of institutions and procedures that we've been discussing here.
Should we, Frank, you want to start?
Just maybe a brief comment. Well, we had some discussions about the relation of the kind of participation that we're talking about to the internet, which is a kind of private event. It certainly facilitates the spread of information, which is crucial, but people aren't talking to each other in any direct way, and there's typically something about this that comes up, can come up in direct dialogue, almost in a kind of dialectical sense, where you say this and I say, oh, well, I never thought of that, and we go on to something else and we arrive at a separate conclusion, whereas with these kinds of responses, it's sort of a one-off thing. I send back what I think. It doesn't mean I wouldn't get necessarily some feedback, but it's a tricky question. It is a different thing than what the kind of mechanisms that we've been talking about. I think we have to think more about the interrelation between those.
Archon?
Yeah. Is more participation always good? No, I don't think so, right? I think that participation, you want more participation when there's a problem that it can solve, democratically speaking, right? So if, if there's lots of equality and social justice and no exclusion, and government's really wise, then no, don't participate. Schumpeter, the Austrian economist, said that entrepreneurs invent things, and then once they get boring, government takes it over, right? So my view is that citizens, you want them in, you want more participation when there's a hard job to do. But once it's been routinized and the solution has been routinized, then government can take it over. That's fine. So for me, citizens are kind of a SWAT team to kind of solve these tough problems, right? And that brings us to you actually had two questions embedded. One was about complex issues and trade-offs, and the other was about routinizing and embedding some of these participation routines. And so on the trade-offs, I think that citizens ought to be involved when the existing processes of representative government are failing to make the trade-offs well. To wit, the deficit and debt crisis, right? So you have very extreme positions in Congress, et cetera. They just cannot get it together, right? So I had the privilege last summer of being part of a research effort that looked at a big public deliberation of 3,000 people in 20 communities, all on a Saturday, talking about debt and deficit, federal debt and deficit issues, trying to balance priorities, taxing and spending, lots of different kinds of people there across the political spectrum. And they came up with answers with lots of agreement, right? And so they were able to make these trade-offs in a quite different context much more effectively because they weren't subject to the same kinds of political pressures and constraints. Another example, in British Columbia, a couple of years ago, they were deciding whether to move their whole voting rule system away from first past the post to some sort of proportional representation. They convened a citizens' assembly of 160 people who met every other weekend for a year and came up with a very reasonable proposal, right? So that's one way of dealing with a highly technical issue. The way we deal with that here is we appoint bodies and legislatures to make the decisions, and what do? They draw districting lines that'll guarantee their reelection, hence the 98% reelection rate that I pointed out to earlier, right? It doesn't work. When it doesn't work, there's a reason for more citizen participation, right? And then finally, in terms of embedding the practices, many of the countries that we looked at, I want a law student to do this at some point. I bet if you looked at all the constitutions that have been revised after 1990, you'll find incidences of these kinds of mechanisms in national constitutions, right? Probably before 1970, you won't find any. After 1980, 1990, you'll find lots of them. So that's one way of formally embedding and routinizing. But I don't think that's enough. Another way is just to get the habit and the repertoire out there. I was, talking to Brian. I mean, it seems to me, not being a Brazil scholar, that you can't come up with an innovation in Brazil now unless it has some heavy dose of citizen participation, because it's part of the repertoire and a norm in a way that's unimaginable if the main thing you think about is U.S. politics, right? So there are ways of embedding that are also in just by putting it as part of the policy repertoire and creating a norm of participation.
Stephanie?
So I guess briefly about two comments. One is about the internet, and Frank mentioned one sort of word of caution, and I would add another, in that it strikes me as a pretty typical idea that someone who lives in the capital city, who has access to a computer, who has internet all day, would have about consulting citizens. But I would not consider that participatory in nature, in the way that once you get out of the capital city, you would want to, it's still very exclusive. In terms of the, is more participation good, I like to build on Archon's point about, it's important, participation is needed when there's a problem to be solved, but I also think that we need to be ready to accept the outcome. And your question, when it's good, what is good? And the case that the example I always point to is Evo Morales in Bolivia, the president of Bolivia. Bolivia passed the Popular Participation Law in 1994. Some have argued that then empowered indigenous communities. That was one of its goals. And then the indigenous communities then elect Evo Morales to represent them as the first indigenous president of Bolivia. Now, once in power, he changes the Constitution, right? And he periodically kicks out U.S. diplomats, right? And so is that good? I mean, I think that's democracy in Bolivia, whether we like it or not. And so I think that I would just add to that as a response about, is it good? So.
Frank wanted to make a quick comment.
Yeah, just a quick point on that. I too think that we don't want to participate on everything, that there are some things that don't lend themselves to this. They're not interesting questions to participate about. Participation could even be problematic, but I would worry that the government decides when to take this back and when not. I'd prefer to see it open, that citizens who have lots of things to do, there is a kind of deliberative economy, could decide themselves when this is not interesting, we don't really have anything to contribute. They can fix the zoning laws in some technical way or something. I'm not exactly sure where to draw those lines, but I think in a democratic society, that's an important thing to think about.
I want to make just a couple of really quick points because I realize it's 3:30 and Blair's going to wrap up. The first point is in some of the more successful cases of participatory governance, you have the middle class that has enough levels of wealth that they don't rely on the local state, which means they rely on the market, and so therefore it's disputes among low-income individuals seeking state resources, which then has this effect. The programs aren't as controversial as they might be in places where you have the middle class who is in competition. So in terms of participation, it's a different body. In terms of the last point, just really quickly I want to make is in my experience, when these programs work well, you have what Jeffrey Alexander, who's a sociologist at Yale, talks about building bonds of solidarity. He doesn't do it in this context, but you can use the state. You can use the state to build solidarity among people because people are having to make difficult choices about my neighborhood versus your neighborhood. And when we see repeated evidence that low-income individuals in shantytowns in Brazil will say, you need the sewer project or you need to relocate these people out of a flood zone. They do that on a consistent basis. And that's an area where we see these trade-offs being made by individuals who you wouldn't necessarily expect to have made them when these programs were first envisioned. And I think that sort of gets back to the point. The way that they've developed is very different than how they were first envisioned.
Well, I want to underscore the point. One of the big lessons of the past 2 days for me has been the context really matters a great deal. And in the same form in a different context can have very, very different meaning. Is there too much participation? One of the participants in our discussions, who isn't here right now, but is a professor at one of the University of California universities, and looking at the budget cuts that are coming in California, he was arguing maybe there's too much participation because of the referendum system in California. Context matters. I would point out for people who think that electronic media and social media are changing the world. On the one hand, they are, but Vladimir Putin has a Facebook page, and you can become Putin's friend on Facebook. And I'm not quite sure what difference that makes. Russian legislation is posted on the internet for comment. But somebody has to, not only do people outside the Capitol, that's not such a big issue anymore in Russia, but not only do they have to get on the internet to see it and send in their comments, but somebody actually has to read it and care about it. I don't think Mobile Exxon really depends too much on a Facebook page for influencing policies. So one of the lessons that I took from this discussion is there is no cookbook answer here. None of these mechanisms are a silver bullet. A lot really depends on context. They all require very hard work. And measures of success need to, as many of the speakers here suggested, need to take into account that success doesn't necessarily mean major transformation. Success in Brazil doesn't necessarily mean a different income distribution, and yet what these mechanisms do is to teach an art form, perhaps, that you pointed out, or Bob Wilson pointed out, we've lost, the ability to deliberate. And that in and of itself may be an accomplishment, even if there aren't more tangible results. So I want to thank all of my colleagues. I want to thank you in the audience for spending a beautiful day inside this dark room. And I want to thank Brian and his colleagues at Boise State. And we'll pick up the conversation again. Thanks.
Thank you, Billy.